For thousands of years, the fight for land, territory, and resources has dominated the history books, as well as those commanders who fought them. But one century stands out as the bloodiest, a period full of conflicts, wars, and revolutions. The 20th century. A century which saw momentous military advances in both technology and armaments, in the air, out at sea, and on the field of battle. A century that led to a new generation of leaders, whose ideas, maneuvers, and strategies would earn them their place in history as military masterminds. Napoleon Bonaparte's swift attacks took advantage of a military tactic based on the use of overwhelming power that paralyzes the enemy. A tactic that is still used in modern warfare, known as rapid dominance.
Rapid dominance is a military strategy, otherwise known as shock and awe, and this is where an army will display a huge amount of force to attack an enemy and completely undermine their morale.
Dominance is all about putting that vast amount, that preponderance of force onto the enemy to make sure that you can overwhelm them and compel them to do your will.
And during some of the major conflicts of the 20th century, the world would witness 4 military masterminds using rapid dominance to achieve absolute and stunning victories. Ever since the creation of the Israeli state after the Second World War, tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors had been tense. The next few decades would see many incursions and battles between these fierce rivals, each backed by one of the superpowers, Israel by the Americans, and countries such as Syria and Egypt supported by the Soviet Union. But in the late 60s, this strain in relationships would all come to a head. On the 13th of May 1967, the Soviets secretly warned the president of Egypt about an imminent Israeli attack on Syria. At that time, Egypt and Syria had an agreement. If Israel attacked Syria, Egypt would come and help. Believing the Soviets, President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt issued an order.
Gamal Abdel Nasser started moving all his forces, and this was the beginning of the escalation that led to the 1967 war.
It was believed by many that Moscow was instigating a war to increase Arab dependence on Soviet aid. But with the Egyptian army on the move, alarm bells started ringing in Israel, and the government was put on alert. At this time, the distinctive-looking Moshe Dayan was Minister of Defense of Israel. For the Israelis, his trademark eye patch had become a symbol of victory. He realized that his country was at a crossroads. A war with Egypt could also mean a confrontation with its Arab allies. Egyptian President Nasser ordered the blockade of the Straits of Tiran, a strategic position that gave Israel an outlet to the Red Sea, further increasing Israel's and Dayan's fears of an imminent attack.
There is no question that this is not only our right to enjoy freedom of traffic, of navigation to our port in Eilat in Aqaba, but also that it's absolutely impossible for Israel to stay a long time without it.
Tensions had reached boiling point. And on the morning of June 5th, 1967, Moshe Dayan surprised the world by launching a preemptive strike against his adversaries, that would go down in history as the Six-Day War.
Moshe Dayan was born in Palestine when it was still under the Ottoman Empire. Before even the British got to there, he was born in a kibbutz, which is called Degania, and later moved to a place called Nahalal, and he grew up there.
In 1929, at the age of 14, Dayan joined the ranks of a paramilitary group called the Haganah, an underground organization that safeguarded Jewish settlements from Arab attacks. There, he learnt guerrilla warfare, and his clandestine activities in this illegal organization landed him in jail. Apprehended by the British authorities, he remained in prison for 2 years. But during the Second World War, he was released in 1941 to join the Allies in their struggle to defeat Nazi Germany. During this period, at the age of 26, he lost his left eye while looking through binoculars that were struck by a sniper's bullet.
His injury had a long-term impact on him, and he was quite annoyed of the attraction because of the black eye patch.
After the Second World War ended, so too did the British occupation of Palestine, and the country was split to create 2 new states, an Arab state, Palestine, and a Jewish state, Israel. On May the 14th, 1948, Israel gained its independence. The next day, neighboring Arab nations declared war, siding with the Palestinians who claimed their land had been stolen. Israel would have to battle hard for its independence. At the time, Moshe Dayan was commander of the Jerusalem front.
He had quite a lot of operational experience before the State of Israel was actually founded, and had sort of gained a reputation as being a tough and brave fighter. So when the War of Independence came along, he was quite an important figure and was eventually given quite a significant role in battles for Jerusalem. So he made his name during the wars of independence.
After a little more than a year of fighting, the Israeli forces prevailed over their opponents. But as well as being a fighter, Dayan was also gaining respect as a man of peace as well.
In the aftermath of the 1948 war, he negotiated with the Jordanians how to partition Jerusalem between Jordan and Israel. And there was Moshe Dayan, the fighter and the diplomat. The mixture between the two will have a long impact on him as he will negotiate in the future as a diplomat.
For the Arabs, defeat at the hands of the fledgling Israeli state was a seismic political moment that would lead to years of more conflict.
In 1953, Moshe Dayan was appointed Chief of Staff Commander of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces. 3 years later, he led the Israeli forces in the Suez War against Egypt.
In 1954, a new Egyptian president came to power, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who began by heightening Arab-Israeli tensions. After he took command of the Suez Canal, once the British had agreed to relinquish its control, war became inevitable.
Egypt had the right to defend herself and defend her territory.
In July 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal.
He also decided to close the Straits of Tiran, the body of water linking Israel with the Red Sea, to all Israeli ships.
France, Britain, and Israel got together and decided to go to war against Egypt.
As Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Moshe Dayan would personally command the Israeli forces in what became known as the Suez Crisis. Moshe Dayan planned and led the invasion of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, a great success for the Israeli troops who, in just a few days, managed to seize it. But on intervention from a US-sponsored resolution at the United Nations, French, British, and Israeli troops withdrew, and UN peacekeepers were put in their place. Although the war was a military triumph for the coalition, it became a political victory for Egypt, which managed to retain the canal thanks to the diplomatic support of the United States and the Soviet Union. However, in 1967, just 10 years later, the two nations were at the brink of war again, after President Nasser expelled the United Nations emergency force from the Suez Canal.
As the crisis developed with Egypt over the Nasser's expulsion of UN peacekeeping forces, which had been put there after the 1956 war, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol decided the best way to deal with this was to appoint Dayan as defense minister.
Dayan was remembered as the victor of Sinai, a man capable of leading his nation to success. But he knew that he did not have the military power to defeat the forces of Egypt and their allies, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. His best weapon of defense was to attack. It was necessary to strike the first blow with rapid dominance, and it had to be a resounding one.
The 1967 war, what came to be known as the Six-Day War, surprised everyone, as it came out of the blue.
On the morning of June 5th, 1967, in a sudden and accurate strike, under the command of Dayan, the Israeli Air Force destroyed 90% of the Egyptian aircraft on the ground. A similar airstrike also incapacitated the Syrian Air Force. Nasser's troops were caught by surprise and left vulnerable to ground attack. 14,000 Israeli troops went on to invade and seize the Sinai Peninsula. When, in retaliation, Jordanian planes bombarded the western part of Jerusalem, which had been controlled by Israel since 1948, the Jordanian Air Force was almost entirely destroyed by Israeli attacks. Dayan's troops encircled the eastern, Jordanian-controlled part of Jerusalem, preparing to take over the Old City. In only 6 days, Israel consolidated its overwhelming victory.
The Israeli Defense Forces in 1967 occupied lands and thus changed the face of the Middle East.
Occupying territories in Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, Israel's victory changed the balance of power in the region. Moshe Dayan's leadership, as had been the case in the Suez Crisis, was again key to Israel's dominance. The speed and effectiveness of the surprise attack reinforced his image as a great military strategist. From the moment he began commanding the Israeli forces, he built an aura of invincibility around Israel's army, undeniably making him a military mastermind. But Dayan was not only an icon in times of war. Thanks to his later work in the government of Menachem Begin, his legacy extended to what was unthinkable: peace with Egypt. But it all began in secret.
In many ways, Moshe Dayan is responsible for the peace between Israel and Egypt. Soon after becoming Foreign Minister of Israel in 1977, he traveled to Morocco and met with a representative of the Egyptian government, and they talked about peace between Israel and Egypt.
This would later become the foundation of the peace negotiations at Camp David in the United States, which would eventually lead to peace between Israel and Egypt. Egypt is a strategic nation due to its geographical position. Through the Suez Canal, it connects the Indian Sea with the Mediterranean. Precisely for this reason, decades ago, it was also the target for another military mastermind, the German Marshal Erwin Rommel. Since the early 20th century, the North African country of Libya had been under the control of Italy. In 1940, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini ordered the mobilization of his troops based in Libya through Egypt to seize the Suez Canal, controlled by the British.
So the North Africa front is important, not necessarily from a territorial perspective for the Germans. It influences control of the Mediterranean and supplies to that theatre. It matters because it impacts on British access to the Suez Canal and their then access to the rest of their empire. And it also impacts on British ability to access the oil fields.
The Italian army does not have the necessary equipment and supplies to complete its mission. The British, although outmanned, launch a surprise attack. As the Italian forces retreat in disarray, they are chased back into Libya. Mussolini was desperate and sought help from Germany. Adolf Hitler orders a German special detachment, the Afrika Korps, to travel to Libya to reinforce his Italian allies in February 1941. Commanding the Nazi force was Erwin Rommel, a military man who had distinguished himself for his ability to carry out the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war.
So Blitzkrieg is the technique that the Germans use to launch surprise attacks on their neighbouring countries.
The idea is that you first take out communications with air attacks, and then send in tanks and infantry to mop up resistance.
So you capitalise on the confusion and the breakdown in the infrastructure to sweep in and occupy your territory.
The Blitzkrieg was the hallmark of the Nazi forces, and undoubtedly one of its greatest exponents was Erwin Rommel.
Rommel was born into a middle-class family in Swabia, and his father was a teacher. But he was from quite a aspirational background, and early on he made a career in the army, in the infantry.
Born on November the 15th, 1891, young Rommel enjoyed a happy childhood in southwest Germany.
He enjoys maths, engineering, but academically he's not very strong. So his father actually encourages him to pursue the military career rather than apply for a university. So he graduates from Officer Cadet School in 1911.
He's very much a man who wants to master his craft, essentially. He thrives in the military setting, and he is very interested in studying it both academically and practically.
4 years after joining the army, he was called up to fight in the First World War.
He first serves in France. He then demonstrates recklessness and the forthrightness that he will become famous for. He is absolutely at the head of all action. He gets injured for this, and then later he'll serve in Romania and in Italy.
His deep understanding of his men, his courage and natural gift of leadership early on indicated promise of a great career. Astute and determined, Captain Rommel earned the recognition of those that served with him. His experiences in World War I were published in 1937.
The book Infantry Attacks is still used and has been used in the 50s, so right after the war, in training military leaders, for example, in American war academies. He was very much recognized for his ability to analyze military situations, sometimes counterfactual kind of interpretations of leadership and leading from the front.
After the German defeat in World War I, Rommel remained part of the now reduced German army and was given a new role. Rommel possessed a pronounced talent for teaching, perhaps inherited from his father and grandfather, and was appointed to posts at various military academies. But everything changed with the rise of Nazism. Hitler's Germany was preparing little by little for a new war. In 1937, now a lieutenant colonel, Rommel temporarily instructed the Hitler Youth. He was then appointed commander of the troops guarding the Führer's headquarters, and it was there where he started to impress Hitler. Rommel's chance to prove himself as a commander came in February 1940, when he assumed command of the 7th Panzer Division, a combined artillery and infantry unit.
Well, Panzer Division is an armoured division, which is a combined arms formation, is a self-sustaining military unit. You harness the firepower, the armour, the mobility of your tanks, but you also have your artillery and your infantry units attached to it to protect the tanks and then also to be able to hold the territory once you break through.
Despite having never commanded armoured units before, he quickly grasped the tremendous possibilities of their offensive role. His division was called to northern France in May 1940, and with daring and initiative, Rommel decided to carry out a surprise night penetration through the French defensive line. The operation was a success and provided the first proof of his bravery and resourcefulness. He continued to advance rapidly with his 7th Panzer Division.
It becomes known as the Ghost Division because he is able to use a number of tactics to advance incredibly quickly, and he sends a telegram to Hitler saying, "I am on the coast." So we see there this use of mobility and firepower and deception. He manages to sort of advance on Cherbourg so quickly that the garrison surrenders in surprise.
In recognition of his success in France, he is assigned to the Africa Corps to aid the all but defeated Italian army in Libya. Rommel is an aggressive and determined commander. After his arrival in Libya, he quickly moves from defending his positions to taking the offensive.
Within 3 small encounters, it effectively drives the British out of Libya. He then maximises on this and goes on to pursue the British all the way up to the Egyptian border in a series of absolutely mind-blowing attacks.
The speed of their movements achieved crushing victories over the Allies, forcing the British forces to entrench in Tobruk, a port city on Libya's eastern Mediterranean coast near the Egyptian border. Due to his audacious surprise attacks, Rommel is nicknamed the Desert Fox by both friend and foe.
The man and the myth sort of merge. The Rommel myth is being written to the advantage both of the Germans, who celebrate his victories, but also the British, who use it to excuse their own military failings effectively.
In May 1942, in the defensive line of Gazala, the Desert Fox carries out one of his most celebrated coups. He makes the British believe that his attack will come from one position, while mobilizing another corps of his army across the desert to outflank them from the other side. Rommel's offensive sows chaos, as the surprise attack on the British from different flanks with an unexpected brutal force devastates the Allied units who were forced to retreat. Rommel continues to advance. Now, his objective is Tobruk, where around 30,000 Allies defend their position. On June 20th, 1942, an intense air and artillery attack on the port city begins. A tank and infantry assault immediately follows.
He manages a surprise attack with 5 full divisions that catches the British completely by surprise, drives through their headquarters, and leaves them absolutely reeling.
The capture of Tobruk was one of the most disastrous episodes for the Allies in the entire Second World War, as tens of thousands of troops were taken prisoner. Hitler, impressed by Rommel's successes, promoted him to Field Marshal. But the scales were about to tip against him. Attempting to take Cairo, Rommel would be defeated by another military mastermind, the famous British general Bernard Montgomery, ending the Field Marshal's African campaign.
In early 1944, Rommel is transferred over to be the General Inspector of the Western Defences, which means that he has to defend, certainly France, from Allied invasion.
But Rommel could see the writing on the wall for Germany, which was beginning to lose the war. He was already expressing his dismay at many aspects of the Nazi campaign.
It was clear to him that the war was lost, but it was also clear that Hitler was unable to accept it and unable to accept the consequences. Hitler was not changing his mind.
On July the 17th, 1944, Rommel's car was attacked by British fighters, and the Marshal was seriously wounded. But as he lay in a hospital bed, it was an event many miles away that would seal his fate. There was a failed assassination attempt to blow up Adolf Hitler in his military bunker, and Rommel was dragged into the conspiracy.
What happens, though, is when the July bomb plot fails, is that his name comes up when the conspirator's been interrogated, and therefore he falls under suspicion.
However, Rommel was not aware of the planned assassination. He never accepted the idea of murder for political ends, and, in fact, he had always ignored all execution orders given to him by Hitler. But his name had come up, and now he was considered an enemy of the Führer.
He is visited by two generals who give him three options. They say he can personally appeal to Hitler, he can face a trial, or he can take the honorable way out and commit suicide.
Rommel, the most prestigious German military officer of World War II, incredibly popular in Germany and highly respected by his enemies, poisoned himself on October the 14th, 1944, with the Reich's guarantee that his family would be kept safe. But his place in history was assured, and this military mastermind's legacy lives on. In the United States, many young men eager to receive first-rate military training learned from Rommel's book, Infantry Attacks, the basics that this genius of warfare left for history. One of those students was Colin Powell. His rise through the ranks, both militarily and politically, made him a force to be reckoned with. Having learnt valuable lessons from the prolonged Vietnam War, Powell would change the way in which the United States would engage in conflicts. His first test was in 1989, when Panamanian dictator Manuel Antonio Noriega became wanted by the American justice system.
The Colombian cartels were using Panama as a kind of way station on the way to the United States. And General Manuel Noriega, who became the head of government in Panama, was in league with them. And as a result, Panama became something of a narco state.
Although for a while, Noriega had been an asset for the United States.
He was an informant for the CIA. He was considered an ally, if you will, during the Reagan-Bush era. And then things started changing.
Noriega wielded a huge amount of power over the government. But when it became clear that his candidate was going to lose in the presidential election of 1989, Noriega ordered the cancellation of the whole process. That was the final straw for the Americans.
In 1989, General Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he was the senior officer in the entire United States military when this happened.
President George H.W. Bush gave Powell an order. An invasion of Panama must bring down Noriega's government. Powell was ready to attack and was confident that his strategy would lead the United States to victory. 5 days later, Operation Just Cause began, marking the beginning of a different way of waging war by the United States.
Move in, get it done, and get out.
Born in Harlem, New York, on April 5, 1937, Colin Powell was the son of Jamaican immigrants. Although classing himself as a C-average student and not keen on studying, he had set his sights on college. In 1954, having enrolled to study geology, Powell was impressed by the sight of young men wearing military uniforms in his college. Inspired by this, he simultaneously joined the Reserve Officers Training Corps, a program designed to identify future military leaders.
General Colin Powell, of course, being an African American, he saw challenges along the way, but he's quick to tell you that he never felt it in the military.
Powell later spoke about this experience and described it as one of the happiest of his life. "I not only liked it, but I was pretty good at it," he said. Upon graduation, he received a commission as an Army second lieutenant. After promotion to captain in 1962, Powell received orders that he was being sent to Vietnam. He was one of the advisors sent by the thousands by the Kennedy administration to bolster South Vietnam's army against the Communist North. In the war, Powell wounded his foot and was awarded the Purple Heart. After serving a leave of absence at home, he began his second tour of duty in Vietnam in 1968, receiving a decoration for bravery after rescuing 3 other soldiers from the burning wreckage after a helicopter crash.
His formative experiences were in Vietnam, and I think that shaped his attitudes to how armed force should be used in the future. He had a strong view, I think, that was true of most of those of his generation, that the Vietnam War had been mismanaged and that armed force had not been used properly.
Powell, who also wanted to pursue a civilian career, sought to merge his military vocation with some key positions in the federal government. After obtaining a master's degree at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., Powell gained a prestigious White House fellowship under President Richard Nixon.
By the time he reached the 1980s, he was involved in the White House in political military roles. So I think he brought into those roles the soldiers' appreciation of armed force, but then got a greater understanding of the demands of policymaking.
Around 1983, Powell was promoted to Major General and joined the Pentagon as a senior military assistant. In 1987, Powell was appointed National Security Advisor to President Reagan, and 2 years later, under George H.W. Bush, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the first African American and youngest person to achieve that position. It was at that time that he drew up what years later would become known as the Powell Doctrine, no doubt inspired by the American failure in Vietnam. According to the Powell Doctrine, Washington should not get involved in conflicts where vital national interest was not at stake. If war was the only option, after exhausting all diplomatic channels, military deployment should be forceful, rapid, and dominant, making defeat practically impossible.
And these essentially emphasized the importance, if you're going to do these things, do it to win. Make sure you've got sufficient force and keep public opinion with you.
Make sure you have a clear political purpose in mind when you decide to use military force. and then use it in a way that will decisively allow you to achieve that political objective.
A great test of the Powell Doctrine was during George H.W. Bush's presidency. When Bush was the director of the CIA, the Panamanian general Manuel Noriega had already been on the CIA's payroll for years. But when Noriega became a problem for the Americans, Bush sought to get rid of him with Operation Just Cause.
So the United States had this very ambiguous relationship with General Noriega. On the one hand, he was a source and had been helpful in the past. But on the other hand, he was now running a government that was assisting in the smuggling of narcotics into the United States, cocaine primarily.
For Powell, the operation was an opportunity to put his military ideas into practice. On December the 20th, 1989, Operation Just Cause began.
I think that's where you see the Powell Doctrine falling back into place, where it was get in there with overwhelming numbers. 27,000 troops responded to Operation Just Cause.
Fighter bombers and helicopters initiated a heavy bombardment of Panamanian political and military installations. In a short time, the U.S. Air Force totally annihilated the Central American Army's response capacity of only 12,000 men. U.S. troops quickly took control of the country, meeting little resistance. Guillermo Andara was sworn in as the new president of Panama, and Noriega sought refuge in the Vatican's embassy in Panama City. On January 3, 1990, Noriega surrendered himself to be brought before U.S. justice. In just a few days of conflict, the United States had achieved its objective, and Operation Just Cause was celebrated in Washington as a total success. USA! U.S. troops withdrew completely from Panama in February 1990. Powell's reputation, acquired after the invasion of Panama, would skyrocket in 1991 with the offensive that drove Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait.
We will exploit Iraqi weaknesses with our strengths. They will not be dealing with 15-year-old Iranians being offered up as cannon fodder. They will be dealing with a very powerful, capable force.
Iraq and Saddam Hussein, they rolled into Kuwait and were brutal, quite ruthless as they got into the country. And the President of the United States said, this will not stand. And so Colin Powell, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he instantly knew what that meant, and he took action.
Powell was a key figure in the major transformations experienced by the U.S. Armed Forces since the end of the Cold War.
There was no one like General Powell. No one at all. There was no other African-American general that was prominent, period.
But apart from being the first African-American to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a four-star general, and Secretary of State, his great legacy, the Powell Doctrine, was carried on by several subsequent administrations, both Democrats and Republicans.
Colin Powell was a military mastermind. He understood, he took lessons learned and internalized them in a way that many of us don't. We sort of go through life and we sort of let life go through us, as opposed to him really reflecting.
The Powell Doctrine changed the way the United States waged war, and through it, managed to correct some of the mistakes made by the Americans during the Vietnam War. However, in 2002, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the George W. Bush administration withdrew the doctrine in favor of a new national security strategy, attacking, if necessary, any nation where an immediate threat was detected. After the Al-Qaeda attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, the White House decided to respond forcefully. An attack of such significance on U.S. soil had occurred only once before, 6 decades earlier, when the Japanese bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. In 1941, oil shortages endangered Japan's expansionist plans. Great Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States maintain an oil embargo as punishment for the Japanese invasion of China, which began in 1937.
In Japan, there are no natural oil resources, so the Japanese military relied on imports of oil.
While the United States hoped embargoes on oil and other key goods would lead Japan to halt its expansionism, the opposite happened. It stirred up the anger of its people against continued Western interference in Asian affairs. Emperor Hirohito felt that war with the United States had become inevitable. For the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Isoroku Yamamoto, a war with the Americans would mean imminent defeat. The only chance of success would be a surprise attack on US bases, an offensive so forceful and swift that it would force the United States to negotiate.
Yamamoto was born to a firmly middle-class family. His father, in fact, was part of the famous samurai class. And Yamamoto was always passionate about military history and a very studious young man.
He was very fastidious at school, sometimes referred to as aggressive, even competitive, but he was loved by everybody. He was an extremely charismatic man, and really charisma and strong decision-making and being very, very assertive are great qualities of leadership, and that definitely could be seen throughout his education.
Yamamoto then enlisted in the Japanese Naval Academy and was immediately plunged into the throes of war, as Japan tried to halt Russian expansionist ambitions in East Asia.
In 1904, just as he graduated, the Russo-Japanese War had broken out, and this was where his naval career really started in earnest. He served on a ship during the war, where he was unfortunately badly injured. One of the guns on the Nishan ship actually exploded. He lost 2 fingers and had terrible, terrible shrapnel injuries, which actually stayed with him for the rest of his life.
Once rehabilitated, Yamamoto's career in the Japanese Navy began to flourish.
He was seen, in a sense, as a rising star from a very young age. Incredibly intelligent, sharp-witted, forward-thinking. He was quite an interesting character.
As a lieutenant commander, Yamamoto was sent to Harvard University in the United States to study English.
He'd spent time in America during his naval career, where he had learned English very, very well and also come to know about American customs.
He also learned to play poker. With cards, he realized the need to know and understand the opponent, to weigh the chances of success and to avoid acting impulsively.
Certainly when it comes to his influences in his military career later in his life, poker and gambling was a key part of that.
Upon his return to Japan, he commanded the aircraft carrier Akagi.
Yamamoto was really a pioneer of the use of aviation in combination with naval craft. He had actually, in fact, given command of the very first Japanese aircraft carrier. He had also spent time in the United States looking at things like naval aviation, and he pioneered a couple of things which really proved to be key when it came to the story of naval aviation during the Second World War.
Yamamoto influenced the development of land-based naval aviation. Demanding greater range for bombers, he insisted in them carrying torpedoes, which would be essential for the destruction of battleships. In September 1940, during the Second World War, representatives of Japan, Italy, and Germany signed the Tripartite Pact. Although the military alliance was largely seen as ineffective, as Germany and Japan had divergent interests, it would seal Japan's fate in the global struggle. By then, it seemed to be only a matter of time before the entry of the United States into the conflict. And time was running out for the Japanese. They needed oil. Yamamoto knew that a prolonged conflict with the United States meant disaster for Japan. Applying rapid dominance, he planned a devastating strike, gambling that the Americans would be demoralized by such a brutal offensive. Yamamoto's target was Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the main base for the United States Pacific Fleet.
The attack on Pearl Harbor itself was actually quite simple in its strategy. The idea was to actually approach Pearl Harbor to within striking range with a Japanese task force, including aircraft carriers, and when within range to launch those aircraft directly towards the US Pacific Fleet, which was at that time at anchor in Pearl Harbor, with the primary targets being battleships, cruisers, and also land-based targets.
There were going to be two waves of attacks by the Japanese fleet, and they were going to come as a surprise to the Americans. This was key. If the Americans had intercepted any communications on this, if they had in any way preempted the attack, it was unlikely to succeed.
On December 7th, 1941, at 7:55 a.m. Hawaii time, the first wave of more than 180 Japanese planes began flying over Pearl Harbor. Although the Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers were out on maneuvers, the presence of all of the fleet's battleships was an opportunity not to be missed.
The first wave of bombers was split into 3 different sections. The first lot of planes came through and took the Americans completely by surprise.
Yamamoto's attack was swift and forceful. Within minutes, much of the American fleet and hundreds of aircraft were damaged or destroyed. Later, a second wave of Japanese planes attacked the Americans, but lacking the surprise factor, several Japanese fighters were shot down by anti-aircraft fire.
They did manage to take out around 18 ships in all. So overall, it was a huge success tactically. The raid went really, really well and certainly stunned the Americans, caused a huge number of casualties, and there were relatively few Japanese casualties in response.
But the result of the assault on Pearl Harbor, partly because of that absence of aircraft carriers and partly because it just didn't achieve the amount of destruction that was desired, was never going to win the war.
Yamamoto was incredibly happy with what happened at Pearl Harbor. It was a great Japanese victory, and he was really on a high, and he was regarded as an incredibly successful leader. What happened after that, however, is slightly different.
Strategically and militarily, the successful attack on Pearl Harbor raised the prestige of Isoroku Yamamoto. But geopolitically, Pearl Harbor didn't achieve the ultimate goal. Despite spending time in the US when studying, Yamamoto didn't know the Americans that well. He thought they would capitulate, but instead, it gave them fuel to fight back. The day after the attack, the United States declared war on Japan, fully entering into World War II and forever changing its course. Nevertheless, Yamamoto continued to have military successes in the Japanese offensive in the Pacific. But the blow Yamamoto had inflicted on the United States would not be forgotten, nor go unpunished. Having received intelligence, the US learned that in mid-April 1943, he would visit military bases in the Solomon Islands and launched Operation Vengeance.
Operation Vengeance was the US plan to assassinate Yamamoto. This came about because the US had managed to crack the Japanese secret code that they were using for their communications, and Yamamoto, in perhaps not his wisest move, had decided to go on a morale-boosting tour of Japanese forward bases in the Far East.
It was just after 9 o'clock in the morning, on April 18, 1943, when the military plane in which Admiral Yamamoto was traveling close to the Solomon Islands was shot down by US fighters.
His remains were recovered, they were taken back to Tokyo, and when they went on parade through Tokyo, more than 1 million people turned out to see them. So that gives you some idea of how Yamamoto was viewed.
Isoroku Yamamoto's daring and great contributions to carrier warfare earned him a place among the military geniuses of the 20th century.
He pioneered the idea of using land-based aircraft armed with torpedoes which could strike at long range against naval craft out to sea. And secondly, he also was a real proponent for the idea of grouping together aircraft carriers so that numerous aircraft could be used en masse against large targets. In fact, exactly what happened at Pearl Harbor.
He is regarded as one of the great military leaders of the 20th century, potentially of all time in Japan, really.
Speed, unpredictability, the use of overwhelming power, mastery of the battlefield, and spectacular displays of force that paralyze the enemy and destroy the will to fight were key to the success of the rapid dominance that these four military geniuses implemented in the wars they fought. Dayan, Rommel, Powell, and Yamamoto are four great military strategists who earned their place in the annals of warfare. Without a doubt, they can truly be called military masterminds.